One problem we have in our country is that too little contemporary history is written. Too few people keep notes, too few people write about what happened in their times, and frankly, increasingly, too few know how to write. So last several weeks, we've had these big debates about leaders of the past, Jawaharlal Nehru, Sardar Patel, Krishna Menon, and one important thing that you see while you watch all these debates is that all these people left a lot of record, a lot of paperwork. Even a leader who we don't talk about a lot these days, and in fact, Narendra Modi said the other day in an interview that people like him have also come and gone past, but nobody remembers them. Charan Singh, Chaudhry Charan Singh has left a volume of papers that Paul Brass has now put together and a bunch of volumes of publications. So today, we don't have much of that. That's why it is such a wonderful idea that Montek, you put this book together. And this is not just about your UPA years, but UPA years are the most recent 10 years. So backstage. So first of all, Montek Singh Ahluwalia, welcome to Off the Cuff. And now, be off the cuff for once. You are much too cautious and diplomatic always. So why this book, given the fact that you are so cautious and so diplomatic?
Well, I don't know if I'm cautious, but you know, why this book is a good question.
You survived.
Oh, that's the proof that I'm cautious.
Cautious, yes.
No, I mean, I felt that, you know, we need to have different narratives. This is not a history. In fact, in the prologue, I say it's also not a memoir. Because, you know, memoirs tend to focus on what the individual did. And I think I was put off the idea, I say, of writing a memoir because somebody described a memoir as a selfie in book form. And, you know...
Don't give people ideas. It will begin to happen like that.
So the idea was really, I see it as a travelogue in the whole journey of economic reform. I mean, most of my interests are in the economic sphere. And I just felt that, you know, I came back to India in 1979, just about when people were beginning to think that our economic policies really weren't delivering what we were hoping they would deliver. And it's been a slow process of change. I've been very privileged in being a participant, along with many others. So I felt that I should write about how things happened. I mean, what happened is well known. And of course, it's an analyst's job to judge whether the right thing was done, testing hypotheses. I'm not doing any of that. I'm just telling a story.
In any case, economics should never be analyzed by economists.
That's also true.
Not in this city, at least. So, Montek, before we come to UPA, and you know my colleague Ramya Nair, who's our senior editor, and she covers...
One-man army.
One-woman army. Hasoge, huh?
Hasoge.
Right. One-woman army. She covers business, economy, finance, everything for us. Before UPA, there was Narasimha Rao and Manmohan Singh. Before Manmohan Singh 2A and 2B, that's UPA 1 and 2, there was Manmohan Singh 1. That was 1991. So a lot of these people, a lot of the people in this hall were not born in 1991. I guarantee that to you. And not many would have many memories of 1991. So give us an idea what India was like for a common person like us, pre-reform and post-reform.
Well, let's take 91 as the major reform, because actually the truly pre-reform India was prior to 1980.
Right.
Old-fashioned government control, suspicion of the private sector, think the public sector should do everything.
It continued, except for one company, suspicion of the private sector continued. I think Reliance broke out.
Well, Reliance certainly broke out, but I don't think it just, I would say in the 1980s, I mean, Mrs. Gandhi came back in the 1980s, I write about it. We knew that, you know, she had in the past, on the economic side, sort of been very solidly anchored in the left view. And we wondered when she came back, I mean, what would her position be? And the truth is that in the 1980s, she began to change. I mean, some of the policy statements brought in words like productivity, little bit of liberalization here, a little bit of liberalization there. I worked for Rajiv Gandhi as Prime Minister. Now, you know, he was the first person to actually say we've got to get to the 21st century, which in those days, in 1985, was 15 years away. And in Parliament, he had said we cannot expect to compete with other countries if we are working with systems that are 20 years out of date. You know, earlier, the approach was we must improve our systems. Here was a Prime Minister saying this system is totally out of date. But not that much got done in changing it, because that's a different, how politics worked. He didn't have much time, etc., etc. By the time you reached 1991, I mean, we were in the middle of a balance of payments crisis. That's towards the end of the VP Singh government. So I think the time was ripe to actually use the crisis as an opportunity. And that is what that government did. Manmohan Singh, as Prime Minister, as Finance Minister, was very aware that you needed broad-ranging change. Narasimha Rao backed him fully as Prime Minister. And I think for the first time you got an articulation of a different kind of economic policy.
So the before and after story, my favorite before and after stories, I've heard them before, but tell others. One, when I remember that, I start smelling gasoline in my nostrils. So this is a dry cleaning story and the credit card story, before and after reform.
Well, I don't know if I wear that figures, but I mean, it's true that personal life before the reforms was very much mired in old-fashioned technologies. And a colleague of mine, N.K. Singh, and I were sort of getting into some lift. And we sort of felt that, you know, somehow there's a smell of petroleum in the air. And we came to the conclusion that it must be the dry cleaning that one of us had done on our suits. And also, the absence of credit cards made a huge difference, because when you landed up as a secretary to the government of India in a hotel, you didn't have a credit card that could be used internationally.
Only India and Nepal.
Yes, you could use it in India and Nepal. But actually, that's true. But very few secretaries went to Nepal, so they never got the benefit of that, you know. I mean, when you checked into a hotel in London or in New York, somebody from the embassy had to be there and sort of put their credit card just in case you undertook some expenses that you later on didn't pay for. So I mean, these are minor sort of things. But most importantly,
so that led to modern dry cleaning machines being imported.
Hopefully.
and also Indian credit cards becoming valid overseas.
Yes, on the financial side, that was a very major step. But that only illustrates, I mean, look, when I came back to India, one of the most onerous decisions you had to take when you bought a car was, are you going to buy an Ambassador or a Fiat? I mean, those were the only two choices available. So, you know, the range of consumer goods that expanded during and after liberalization, some of it was even before 91. I mean, after all, Maruti came on the stage it was the first Maruti rolled out in 1983. I'm not a great believer in big bang reforms, you know, doing everything in 1 year or 2 years. But in my view, what we did in 30 years, we should have been able to do in 15. And it's an interesting question, why did it take so long? And in a democracy, I mean, everybody's view has to be taken into account, and that forces many compromises. That takes more time. Well, I mean, I'd rather live in a democracy which reforms a little bit over a longer time than not. But I still think that if we had a clearer political commitment to the need to do these things, we should have done what we did in 30 years in 15 years or so.
So you talk about how good economics makes for good politics in the long run. But except for probably 1991, do you think the policymakers have adhered to this principle?
Well, you know, the thing about 1991 was that it wasn't just something that was done, but that Dr. Manmohan Singh outlined, if you like, the strategy behind the new system. And the strategy was not a repetition of the old. But even there, I mean, we didn't do everything that we should have done. I mean, things got done rather slowly. But you're right, it is ultimately the ability of the political system to sell the reforms that really makes the biggest difference. Now, you know, if a politician looks back at how things have moved, I think they would conclude that most of what has been done in reforms has been a winner. But the problem with reforms is that, you reform, and what that allows people to do is to sort of excel in what they're capable of. Their comparative advantage is revealed, etc. But they never think that they're doing this because of the reforms. They think they're getting all these benefits because they themselves are good, and which is true.
So Dr. Manmohan Singh as Prime Minister and Dr. Manmohan Singh as Finance Minister before that. Was it the same person or was it different persons?
Well, that's a very good question because, it wasn't the same economy and it wasn't the same circumstances. I mean, I think Dr. Manmohan Singh as Finance Minister, most people would agree that what he did in that very short period is truly historic. But of course, he came he was brought in by Mr. Narasimha Rao into a government that had inherited an unbelievable mess. So you could go to the public and say that, look, what you thought of as good policy just isn't working. So we've got to do something different, okay? I think he did more than just control the crisis, because if they had only wanted to control the crisis, they could have stopped reforming by 1993. But they used the crisis as an opportunity to sell a new line, that basically we are going to move towards a more private sector oriented economy, much more open to the world. Foreign investment is welcome. Technology should be allowed more freely. And firms should decide the technology they want, not some babu. I mean, earlier, the babus were deciding, is this technology really good for India or not? So I think these were big changes. But, these are the low-hanging fruits when you're a low-income
I think in many areas they are still deciding. The same problems.
I think, I wouldn't be surprised, but much less than before. But, Manmohan Singh as Prime Minister was the Prime Minister of a country that had about to become middle income, was not running a government which had its own majority in Parliament. It was dependent, it was not only a coalition, but the Congress within that coalition did not have the same strength that the Congress within the Narasimha Rao coalition or the Vajpayee.
Although remember, Narasimha Rao government was a minority government.
Yes, but the extent of them are very small. Here they were dependent on the left from outside, and I think it's also true that within the party, I mean, he wasn't the natural choice of the party. I mean, he was appointed by the political leader, who was Mrs. Gandhi.
But in that party, there were a dozen people who in their own eyes were the natural choices for Prime Minister, who didn't get it.
It's very good in parties for everybody to think that they are the natural choice and then to compete. I mean, that's the short answer. But I think, therefore, I don't believe that in UPA, as Prime Minister, he could have got away.
Did he exercise any helplessness sometimes because of these circumstances?
You mean, did he display any help?
No, I mean, he doesn't display very much, nevertheless, but did he, I mean, did you see any helplessness?
No, I think he has himself said that in many areas he was constrained by what he called coalition dharma. I would interpret that to mean that...
So what is it that constrained him more, coalition dharma or the party?
That's very, I mean, I had no role in the political discussions. There must have been political discussions within the party, but I was not part of them. So I would only be speculating. My guess is that both within the party, if you're not the spontaneous choice of the party, you will experience constraints for the simple reason that others would express their views and would be able to lobby for them. But equally, being in the coalition, you have to look at the support of what kind of support you get from other parties.
Was there ever an occasion when you had to say to him, or maybe you felt like saying to him, "Ke don't give in so easily"?
Well, there was one occasion which I mentioned in the book, which actually, I mean, he himself followed that course of action. I'm not saying he did that because of what I mentioned, but that is really on the nuclear deal.
Nuclear deal, yes.
You know, in my view, it was one of the most important achievements of the UPA and a contribution to India's foreign policy and India's security strength. let me just, I don't think it's well understood in India. It was wrongly presented as a deal between India and the US designed to make India come close to the US. The truth is, and Manmohan Singh has said that on many occasions, that look, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty had imposed a kind of nuclear apartheid on India. It was an unfair treaty because 5 countries allowed themselves to have nuclear weapons and prevented every other country from having it. We felt, we were, from the days of Rajiv Gandhi, we were arguing that we are willing to have universal disarmament, that we will commit ourselves not to have nuclear weapons if you commit yourselves in a phased manner to get rid of yours. But we're not prepared to accept a situation where we say no and you hang on to nuclear weapons. I think that was entirely a correct reading of the situation. But nevertheless, the NPT came, and what the NPT said, I mean, put enormous restrictions on anybody who was not a declared nuclear weapons state. And the nuclear suppliers group basically would not trade either fuel...
So it was necessary to become a declared nuclear weapons state?
But there was no mechanism to become a declared weapons state.
Because you had tested anyway.
Yes. Now, so therefore, what the nuclear deal did was, the US helped us to get a waiver from the nuclear suppliers group, which in effect accepted India's nuclear weapons capability, but freed up technology, etc., for safeguarded nuclear reactors. This was a major breakthrough, and for some reason there was enormous opposition domestically. I still haven't been able to understand why there was so much opposition. Anyway, in the end, Dr. Singh was under pressure. Had he succumbed to the pressure, because the left threatened to walk out if he proceeded further, had he succumbed to the pressure saying, let's be safe...
And the left did walk out.
The left did walk out, but, you know, interestingly, the left did walk out. But Dr. Singh, with a bit of support from a few people, was able to get Mulayam Singh and his party to come in and support the deal. And let me say that Mrs. Gandhi had backed him on that. I mean, you must be 100% certain that the nuclear deal would not have happened if Sonia Gandhi had not backed Manmohan Singh. I mention in the book some conversations where, you know, she made the point that, look, the party is not happy with facing an election, which may well have been the case. But I think what Dr. Singh felt was that he had negotiated a very good deal and it would be absurd not to carry it through. Now, you know, think about what would have happened if we had not done it. You know, some people might say, oh, well, it would have happened later. But the fact is the world has changed. I mean, Bush was able to get the Chinese to withdraw their objections.
Would not happen today.
It would just not happen.
Just not happen today.
There's a lot of talk on how, you know, decision making is highly centralized in the current regime, in the Prime Minister's office. How was it in the previous tenures?
No, it was certainly not centralized. I mean, as you know, in a coalition government, things are not centralized. There are a few things that, let's say, the Prime Minister decides to drive by himself. But otherwise, I mean, the logic of a coalition government is that ministers who are responsible for certain things sort of end up doing as best they can. And, you know, I don't think, although technically our system is one in which the Prime Minister can overrule any minister, the logic of that is that he can overrule the minister because the minister can always resign if he wants to. But if you're running a coalition, you can overrule your own party ministers. You can't be overruling members of the coalition. That was the problem.
He did not overrule his own party ministers. They kept on overruling him.
No, but I don't think that's...
your finance minister, your environment minister, they were all overruling your
prime
minister.
No, I think that's not fair.
Do you trust the numbers that the government puts out? There's a lot of concern over the transparency of the credibility of India's statistics.
I think that is a new, I mean, I mentioned in my last chapter that this is a major problem. And I feel that, you know, for example, I think the government has recognized that people are worried about this. What they've done is to set up an advisory committee. It has excellent people on it, but you know, an advisory committee is only an advisory committee. What you need to do is to set up a first-class statistical system, professionally run, and the clearance of statistical data should not be subject to ministerial control at all. In the UPA, we had done that, in the sense that...
India is a unique country with a minister for statistics.
Yeah, it's a...
So what does he or she do?
Well, I mean, you're making a good... We have a minister of everything. I mean, you know...
So going back to data, you know, is it really possible for the government to not interfere with data?
Absolutely. Absolutely. By the way, during the UPA regime, we had set up the National Statistical Commission. We set up a chief statistician of India. You know, originally, all these NSSO, they used to be in the planning, under the Planning Commission. I moved them out. We set up the National Statistical Commission and laid down the framework that the commission would be the final say in whether the data are released or not. The ministry will have no role in it whatsoever.
But you didn't give it statutory backing, right?
Yes,
because
that,
of which,
I mean, you know, there was a proposal that it should become... I mean, if we had given it, I agree, we should have given it statutory backing. We worked that system. Look, we assumed that, you know, in all this statutory backing business...
Do you trust the data that's coming out of this government now?
Well, that depends on what you mean. Look, when you say trust the data, I mean, I think, for example, I would still say that survey data are not easily manipulated. So my guess is that all the survey, I mean, for example, in the case of the employment survey, the data was not fiddled, but the survey wasn't released until after the general election. So that suggests that the data was all right, but it wasn't released the way it should be. Internationally, I mean, the statistical system should have predetermined dates of
So
release.
what happens to a country's credibility when data which is available, a survey is done, is deliberately held back until the elections? Does it affect a country's credibility or it doesn't?
Look, in the world of data, it does, and it's one of those things, you know, if everything is going well, everything is forgiven. But when things are not going well, then people point out that, you know, why are things not going well? And then the government says because of A and B, and then somebody says, oh, but we can't trust your data. This is not just in India. I mean, in Greece, for example, when they had their crisis several years ago, it turned out that they were fiddling the budget deficit massively.
But our data should not look like Greek to us.
Yeah, I agree.
I'm Dalbir Singh from the Congress Party. If you were a finance minister today and you enjoyed as much confidence of the Prime Minister as you enjoyed of Dr. Manmohan Singh, what will be a couple of big things that you will do to revive the state of economy today?
Well, I mean, this is very tough. I mean, you can't throw a question to an unprepared. First thing is, whoever is the finance minister should look at the facts in great detail, and I don't have that at the top of my head. But I mean, at the tip of my fingers or the top of my head. So I'm not in a position to say what we should do. But I mean, what I would do if I was in that position. But it seems to me a few things are very important. First, we must recognize, are we in a difficult situation or not? Now, the finance minister has repeated the 5 trillion economy target for 2024 or 24-25. Now, if she is of the view that we are on track for that target, then she should just carry on doing what she's doing. But my view is that we are nowhere near being on track. I mean, the present position is that the quarterly low point in growth is about 4.5%. Probably we will end the year below 5%. To reach the 5 trillion target, the average growth rate, counting this year, should be 9% over 6 years. We're going to get less than 5, and maybe next year more than 5. We are not on track. So unless somebody gets up and says, you know, we're not on track, so now I'm producing a budget to put us on track, you don't get the right answer. Similarly, I mean, we have the target of doubling farmers' incomes by 2022. Now, and that was also repeated, by the way. So it's a simple question. If we are going to double farmer income by 2022, we should just carry on doing what we're doing. The problem is we're not going to double farmers' income. Agriculture is doing worse than it was in the previous period. And frankly, there's no way in which you can double farmers' income unless you can take a lot of farmers off the land and put them into other jobs. And that's the other big non-performance, which is jobs. So I think the first thing a finance minister should do is to let the people know what the state of the economy is. And I mean, that would get people thinking. I mean, two other areas where I can mention. One is private investment. I mean, the big decline in demand is because private investment has collapsed. We need to know why that is so. Why is there a loss of confidence on the part of the private sector? The government has to engage with the private sector. I mean, Rahul Bajaj says there's a fear factor. Not clear what he meant. Is it taxation? Is it some of these other laws? Whatever. But you need to engage in a credible way so that people are reassured that's not a problem. Exports is a disaster. Okay? Now here I'll make a very positive, a concrete suggestion. I think it was a big mistake to raise import duties. You know, one of the key elements of the 1991 reforms was that we are entering into a phase of gradual reduction in import duties, because that is how Indian industry will become competitive.
Which Vajpayee continued.
Yes. Narasimha Rao Manmohan Singh started it. The United Front government continued it. Vajpayee continued it. It's now been reversed. Now, it's interesting. I mean, we are, on the one hand, we are saying that we must get a bigger share of global value chains. I think that's absolutely correct. The economic survey says that this is very important. And given the way trade is going, there's no way you're going to get good exports if you don't have a piece of the global value chain network. And the survey says the way to get into the global value chain is to have low duties on intermediate goods. That's not what we're doing. So, you know, the economic survey was presented in Parliament one day before the budget, and the budget sort of jacked up duties. There's a complete dissonance between these two. So there are many things that really need to be done.
So is it time that we do away with the economic service now that, you know, even the government doesn't listen to its own economic survey?
No, to be fair, the economic survey...
Any resemblance with the budget is not even coincidental.
I think part of the problem, to be fair, the economic survey has never been a predictor of what the budget will do. But in the old days...
it's a predictor of directions. Now, you can't be going in different directions.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. I mean, that's totally fair.
I was wondering what your view is on India staying out of RCEP, and also what is your response to the Commerce Minister's statement that every free trade agreement that India has entered into over the past several years with every country has only been against India's national interest and should be revised or thrown out? This is in the context of what you said about the gains that came to the country.
I can give you my view for what it is worth. On the issue of whether free trade agreements have been successful or not, there's a very long section in the economic survey which says that the view that they have been harmful is wrong. So the minister would be well advised to read the finance ministry's economic survey and then make up his mind whether the survey is wrong or he's wrong. Take a look at the survey. I share the view of the survey. It's totally wrong to say that the free trade agreements that we've entered into have had negative effects. Not true. On RCEP, I think it was a big mistake. Asia is the growing part of the world. This is the part of the world that we've been wanting to integrate with. I mean, earlier governments had announced a look east policy. This government had announced an act east policy, and that made me feel that, you know, we would see faster action. After many years of negotiations, India did not sign the RCEP. Now, by the way, I think we can still join. I don't know what the period is. That option is still open.
13th March, I think.
Yeah, so I would, if I were asked, we should join. No question about it. And quite frankly, what sort of a face does India present in East Asia if it says it cannot compete with other Asian countries? It just doesn't make any sense in my view. And especially because the fear is always that China would be is a big kind of fear-creating element. There's a long period of during which the duties had to be reduced, particularly the duties on China. So the transition period that was allowed to allow full competition with China was quite long. And what we need to do is to do what is necessary to make Indian industry competitive in this period. So I think the decision on joining RCEP is extremely unfortunate, and I hope that the government will see the wisdom in what I'm saying and actually join, which they still can do.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Udit Baka. I'm an entrepreneur. So as we were talking, you were mentioning like 1990s was the consumerism time where the consumer goods and all were on a boom. Then we have seen IT and other things. So what do you see the future from now? Where is the growth story for the next decade? And what should the government do to bring it up?
I remain of the view that India credibly can aim at getting back to an 8% growth. That won't mean that you'll do it tomorrow. But to my mind, the touchstone of success of a government should be, is it getting back to 8% growth? And we should not have targets only for 5 years from now. We should have annual targets and measure whether we are achieving them. I think this can be done. Now, it would take too long to make a list of things. I've already talked about some things. You need to move in that direction. If you are going to get that kind of growth going, then there are 2 or 3 things that are very crucial. One, that will only happen if private investment recovers. By the way, I don't think that the solution lies in foreign private investment. That's good, but it's in domestic private investment, because FDI is only a small part of the total investment. So it's no good saying FDI is increasing if the domestic investors are somehow not investing. So we need to do something to take care of their problems. That's a big agenda. But I think if the government were to sort of engage with the private sector and get a sense that what is it that you want, they would get a pretty fair idea of what is bugging private individuals. I think restoring health to the banking system is overwhelmingly important. Also, bringing the fiscal situation under control. And bringing the fiscal situation under control is not to be achieved simply by reducing expenditure. Actually, it has to be achieved by increasing total expenditure, but increasing total revenues even more. So you have to ask yourself, how are you going to do that? I mean, for example, I'm a great supporter of the idea of the GST. It was meant to generate more revenues. It has generated less. And the reason is it's been badly designed and badly implemented. But unless somebody agrees with that, you can't have a correction. I mean, everybody, if you're just happy with saying GST is a reform, then there's no debate.
So just to steer the conversation back to you, your name Montek is quite unusual. Is there a story behind the name? What does this mean? If you could just let us know.
I'll tell you, it's quite amusing. There's a little bit of contextualization. See, I was born in 1943, and at that time, the Second World War was going on, and the Indian Army in Africa was much in the news. And of course, the general on the Allied side was Montgomery. And Montgomery had a nickname called Monty.
Monty.
So in every Punjabi family, whenever a boy is born and grows up, they say, "To military mein jayega, general banega," etc. So I acquired the nickname of Monty. So after a while, my parents said, "Look, they've got to give him a proper name. I mean, this is no good. So why not give him a name that will not force him to drop the nickname?" So my father said, "I like the name Montek. Sounds good." And he spelt it M-O-N-T-E-K. Okay? So somebody asked him that, "Look, if it's Montek, why are you spelling it M-O-N-T-E-K?" And he said, well, Monday is spelled M-O-N-T-E-K. So that's the story.
Pratibha Prahlad, do you think history has been unkind to Mr. Narasimha Rao because he was the first Prime Minister who picked up a non-politician, professional, to become the finance minister of this country, and that really, saw a lot of changes.
There's no question in my view that, we would
I think
not
present is more important.
We would not have had the economic reforms if Mr. Narasimha Rao had not picked Dr. Manmohan Singh. I say in my book that it was clear to me that Mr. Narasimha Rao knew that we had to do things differently, and he was sort of outsourcing the design of the reforms to Manmohan Singh. He may not have been technically capable of putting together all the different bits and pieces, but I think he was aware that this needed to be done. He backed his finance minister critically. During the securities scam, for example, when everybody was going around saying this is because of liberalization, which is nonsense, but he backed him. Manmohan Singh actually handed in his resignation because he didn't want the Prime Minister to be embarrassed, and Narasimha Rao sent it back. So that was very, very critical. So there's no doubt in my view. Of course, I argue in the issue of how much credit should go. I feel that I wish Narasimha Rao had been more upfront and led from the front. That was not his personality. I mean, I report this story that one of the journalists said that how come, to Mr. Narasimha Rao, how come you managed to make a 180-degree turn? And he said, no, I haven't made any turn. The world has turned under me.
So did the entire episode of Rahul Gandhi tearing the ordinance change the way, the people look at Manmohan Singh as a Prime Minister or his performance?
And you say that you spoke to Manmohan Singh about it, or he spoke to you about it.
What actually happened was that my brother, who is an IAS officer who had retired and writes for newspapers, he had said that in his view, that the incident should have led Manmohan Singh to resign, and in fact it's a good idea for Rahul Gandhi to come out into the limelight, and people are ready for his leadership and all the rest of it. So he sent me an email, because I was with the Prime Minister in New York. He sent me an email saying, look, I've written this article and I hope it doesn't embarrass you. So I went to the Prime Minister straight away because I wanted him to hear it from me and not from someone else. That I said, look, my brother has written this and you should read it.
Younger brothers, what can you do?
Huh?
Younger brothers, what can you do?
Yeah, well, I said, look, my brother has written this and you look at it. So when he read this, which said that in my brother's view, Manmohan Singh should resign, he turned to me and said, do you think I should resign? It's not that he was thinking about it and he consulted me. It was a very natural reaction that your younger brother thinks I should resign. Do you think I should resign? And I thought about it and I said no. And I had good reasons for that. And the good reasons were in two different areas. One is the substance of what Rahul Gandhi said. What Rahul Gandhi said was that the ordinance that the government was thinking of bringing, which would have altered the law and allowed legislators
essentially Lalu Yadav to carry on.
Well, that would have been a consequence, perhaps an intended consequence. But the idea was that if a legislator is convicted earlier, you have to give up your seat. They found a way that no, you can keep the seat, etc. While it's under appeal. Okay, he said he went to the Congress party was giving a press conference explaining why this is a good thing, and Rahul turned up at the press conference and gave his view. He said, look, this is all compromising with corruption. I don't think it's right. And he said the ordinance is complete nonsense and it should be torn up. That's what he said. So obviously everybody picked up on this and said, isn't this insulting the Prime Minister and all the rest of it? And the Prime Minister should resign. Now, I said, look, on the substance of what Rahul Gandhi said, he was actually right. And the vast majority of people thought he was right.
Rahul Gandhi is always right.
Well, but in this,
that party.
in this particular case, he said, look, that's my view, and many people in my party agree with it. And I felt it would be very odd for the Prime Minister to resign on this issue, because it would imply, how dare you say that we should...
it was the method in which Rahul Gandhi did it.
Then it becomes a process issue. It's not a substance issue. So I think on the process issue, later on, I think Rahul said...
I think some of us used the expression that Manmohan Singh government had lost its Iqbal that day.
Well, you know, I think you guys like putting these things...
Because we don't know such good English, so sometimes it starts from Urdu
but you can say sensible things in Hindi. You don't have to... I think the key issue there was, Rahul Gandhi later on said, well, maybe the form of words I used was not right.
Montek, before we let you go, a question that comes often to my mind. Do you think India has now seen the end of the economic bureaucrat? People like you, Vijay Kelkar, Bimal Jalan, even people who came from All India, from the IAS, Subba Rao, Y.V. Reddy, people who carried on through the tenure of many governments and different political governments, but kept continuity in economic policy making, plus also became specialists in the course of time. First of all, do you think it is true that this species is now gone? And second, is it a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, look, I don't think that the species, you can say the species has gone. Because, I mean, after all, some of the best economists, at least in my time in government, were in fact IAS officers. And
but now there aren't any who are economic bureaucrats from the IAS, except one who's gone to RBI, Shaktikant Das.
Well, I mean, you know, I can't make a judgment about whether this is a fundamental change, but I can certainly say that if it is, it's very unfortunate. The economy is becoming much more complex. The economy is now much more integrated with the world. Technology is changing very rapidly. And you need in government people with a high order of technical expertise. You don't have, if you don't want to get them from outside, then you can take up the existing IAS and send them to the top universities in the world to get the right training. But any notion that you don't need the technical level, this would be a great mistake, I think.
Sir, मेरा सवाल ये है कि प्लानिंग कमीशन और नीति आयोग के बीच डिफरेंस क्या है?
ये तो मैं थोड़ी बता सकता हूँ, because I have no idea what Niti Aayog does. But I have a whole chapter on the Planning Commission, and let me say that, you know, the notion that we were doing old-fashioned planning is wrong. We were aware that the world has changed and planning has to be different. I'll tell you a nice little story which I mentioned in the book. When I went away to the IMF for 3 years in the Vajpayee government, before coming back to be deputy chairman, I was member planning commission at that time, and I had felt that, you know, the planning commission, the phrase is very old-fashioned. It kind of evokes Soviet Union and that kind of thing. So in my farewell call on the Prime Minister, I said to him that, you know, even the Chinese have changed the planning commission. They call it the National Commission for Reconstruction and Reform. So why don't we change our planning commission name and call it something else? And Vajpayee ji thought about it for a while. And he said, nahi bhai, agar ye karenge, to left aise hi naraz ho jayegi. You fellows do what you have to do, but carry on with the same name. So, you know, I think the idea that the important thing is not what it's called. The important thing is what does it do? And in that chapter, I have identified 4 or 5 key tasks which the Planning Commission performed. And I leave it to you and others to decide whether the Niti Aayog is empowered enough to do that. Now, I mean, some things have been taken away from them. They're no longer involved in financial allocation. And you know, frankly, in government, very few people listen to you if you are not actually controlling financial allocations. So I'm sure this makes it difficult to make your voice heard. That's a disadvantage. But on the other hand, if they're really working on evolving new policies and trying to persuade people to do the right thing, I mean, that's a good thing.
So Montek, on that note, since I know all of us are hungry, we have to bring this to an end. I wish we could have gone on, but remember, Montek has just started writing. He has lots of stories to tell. He's not done yet. And my request and goading to Montek is that the next one should be about the people he's worked with all his life, and he should tell stories more than policy. So when that happens, we'll be back with Montek, and good luck with this book. It's a great contribution to contemporary history.
Thank you.